All right, so picture this. You step out onto your back porch, with your coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the morning peace by your beautiful pond. But instead of like these serene reflections, you're met with a thick layer of green algae. It's taken over. It's a problem that so many pond owners face. And you, dear listener, you wanted to know if a surprisingly simple solution might hold the answer. Barley straw. We've got a stack of research on this, including a scientific paper from Purdue University, and even some intriguing snippets about a Danish school project tackling this mysterious green pond.
It's fascinating is what it is. This isn't some new age fad. People in England have actually been using barley straw to control algae since the early 1990s, even in large reservoirs. But the science behind it is still a bit of a mystery.
Okay, so the sources mention this idea that as the barley straw decomposes in the water, it releases some kind of chemical that inhibits algae growth. Sounds almost like magic, right?
It does have a bit of a folk remedy vibe to it, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's been a fair amount of research trying to figure out exactly how it works. The prevailing theory is that it's not the barley itself, but the fungi that decompose it that produce this algae-inhibiting chemical. The problem is we still don't know the exact chemical or combination of chemicals responsible.
So it's less about killing the algae outright and more about stopping it from spreading.
Exactly. The term for that is algistatic, meaning it prevents new growth of algae rather than being algicidal, which would mean it kills existing algae. Think of it like stopping the spread of a weed rather than uprooting the existing ones.
So I'm guessing this isn't as simple as chucking a whole bale of straw into the pond and calling it a day.
You got it. Methods are crucial. Just tossing a bale in there won't do much. The Purdue paper emphasizes that the straw needs to be prepared properly. It needs to be broken up, placed in netting to allow for good water and air circulation, and strategically positioned in the water body.
Ah, so that's where those Christmas tree netting tubes mentioned in the Nebraska guidelines come in. Pretty ingenious way to apply it, I'd say.
It is, and the placement is key, too. They recommend distributing the straw in multiple locations, especially in larger ponds, to ensure better coverage.
You mentioned research, but looking at these studies, the results seem all over the place. Like the Purdue study had some success in the lab, but less consistent results when they tried it out in larger settings.
That seems to be a recurring theme. Some studies show real promise, particularly those done in controlled lab environments where you can isolate variables. But field studies like the one in Nebraska on a lake with blue-green algae blooms showed no improvement at all. And it seems like different algae species respond differently to the barley straw treatment, too.
So what's the takeaway for someone like our listener who's battling a green monster in their pond? Is barley straw a miracle cure or a bust?
The research paints a mixed picture. There's definitely evidence it can be effective in some situations, but it's not a guaranteed solution. The success seems to hinge on a lot of factors, like the type of algae you're dealing with, water temperature, nutrient levels in the water, and even how the barley straw is prepared and placed.
Hold on, if the science is this murky, why are people even trying this? What's the appeal of barley straw over other methods?
Well, for one, it's a natural solution, which is appealing to many pond owners who want to avoid using harsh chemicals. It's also relatively inexpensive and readily available. And even if it doesn't completely eradicate the algae, it might be enough to keep it under control, especially when combined with other methods.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this has become such a popular folk remedy. But what about the case in Minnesota mentioned in the Purdue paper? They seem to have some success there.
Right. This was a lake in Lakeville, Minnesota, where they added barley straw for 2 years and saw improvements in water clarity. They also measured reductions in chlorophyll, which is the green pigment in algae, and phosphorus, a key nutrient that fuels algae growth.
So maybe the barley straw is making the water less hospitable for the algae to thrive, even if it's not directly killing it off.
That's one possibility. It could be indirectly controlling algae by reducing nutrient levels in the water, sort of like cutting off its food supply. But it's hard to say for sure without more controlled studies.
So it sounds like there's still a lot we don't know, but at least for someone with a pond, it might be worth experimenting with, especially given it's a fairly low-risk approach.
Exactly, and that's what makes this so interesting. It's a natural process, which by definition is going to be complex and variable. There's a lot of room for individual observation and experimentation to see what works best in different situations.
You know, this whole thing reminds me of when I tried using compost tea to fertilize my garden. Sometimes those old-school natural methods really do work. But just like with the compost tea, it sounds like the devil is in the details with this barley straw method.
Absolutely. We've talked about the science and the research, but let's get practical for a moment. If our listener wants to try this out on their own pond, what do they actually need to do?
Well, thankfully, the Purdue paper includes some pretty detailed guidelines from the University of Nebraska, which seem like a good place to start. Let's dive into those next.
All right, so let's break down these Nebraska guidelines. First off, timing is key. They recommend applying the barley straw in mid to late April, ideally when the water temperature is above 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
Makes sense. You want to get a head start before those massive summer algae blooms hit. And they're pretty specific about how to prepare the straw right. It's not just a matter of tossing a bale in there.
Definitely not. You need to break up the bales and pack the straw loosely into netting, like the kind you'd use for Christmas trees. This allows for water and air to circulate through it, which is crucial for that aerobic decomposition process.
Okay, I'm picturing someone out on their dock stuffing straw into netting like they're making some giant sausage links.
I know it's a funny visual, but it's a pretty effective way to apply it, especially in larger ponds. And they recommend distributing these straw-filled tubes in multiple locations around the pond to ensure good coverage.
So how much straw are we talking about here? A handful? A truckload?
The guidelines actually provide a formula for calculating that based on the size of your pond. They suggest using 225 pounds of barley straw per acre of water surface area for ponds that have a history of algae problems.
That's a pretty specific number. I guess they've done their research. Anything else to consider when figuring out the right amount?
Yes, they mention that muddy water can reduce the effectiveness of the straw, so you might need to adjust the dosage accordingly. It's all about observation and fine-tuning based on your pond's unique conditions.
All right, so you've got your straw and your netting, you've calculated the right amount, and you're ready to deploy. Where exactly does this straw contraption go in the pond?
Placement is crucial. You want to suspend the straw-filled netting in the upper 3 to 4 feet of water. The guidelines emphasize that the straw loses its effectiveness if it sinks too deep.
So you'd probably need some sort of flotation system to keep it at the right depth.
Exactly. They suggest using floats inside the netting and anchoring the whole thing in place with ropes attached to weights.
Sounds like a fun little DIY project for a pond owner. But let's be realistic here. Even with all this meticulous preparation and placement, you're not going to see results overnight, right?
That's a really important point. Barley straw is not a quick fix. It can take several weeks, even months, for the straw to decompose and release those algae-inhibiting compounds. And even then, it's more about preventing new growth than killing off existing algae.
So patience is key. I bet that's a hard sell for someone staring down a thick layer of green goop in their pond.
It is, and that's why it's important to manage expectations. Barley straw might not completely eliminate the algae, especially if you're dealing with a severe bloom. It's best to think of it as one tool in your arsenal, along with other strategies like reducing nutrient runoff and manually removing algae.
You know, I think this whole deep dive is really highlighting the importance of a holistic approach. It's not just about blindly following a set of instructions. It's about understanding the principles at play and then adapting them to your specific situation.
I agree, and that's what makes this so fascinating. We're dealing with a natural process, which by definition is going to be variable and complex. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So to our listener, if you decide to embark on this barley straw adventure, embrace the process. Keep detailed records of what you try, what works, what doesn't. Maybe even start a pond journal.
Exactly. Pay attention to the details. How does the algae respond? Are there any changes in water clarity? What surprises you?
And don't be afraid to tweak your approach as you go. After all, you're not just controlling algae, you're learning about the delicate balance of your pond's ecosystem.
And that, my friend, is a pretty amazing thing.
It really is. Speaking of learning, let's circle back to that EPA ruling about barley straw being considered a pesticide. It's interesting how something so natural can fall under that category.
It is fascinating, isn't it? It really shows how our regulatory systems often struggle to keep up with these innovative approaches, especially those rooted in, traditional knowledge or natural processes.
So if a company wanted to sell barley straw, specifically for algae control, they'd have to go through this whole pesticide registration process with the EPA.
That's right. They would need to conduct extensive testing to prove its safety and effectiveness, which can be incredibly costly and time-consuming.
I can see how that might discourage some companies, especially if the profit margin on barley straw isn't huge to begin with.
Exactly, and it creates this sort of catch-22. Without that official registration, it's harder to conduct large-scale research and gather the data needed to prove its effectiveness, which then makes it harder to get registered in the first place.
But for the individual pond owner experimenting in their own backyard, it's a different story. They're free to try this out without jumping through all those regulatory hoops.
Right, and that's where the real potential lies, I think. It's in the hands of those who are passionate about their ponds, willing to try new things and share their experiences.
It's almost like a citizen science project in a way. A bunch of pond enthusiasts out there figuring out what works best for their unique situations.
Exactly. And that kind of grassroots experimentation can lead to valuable insights. Who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to crack the code on barley straw and algae control.
Maybe they'll figure out the exact chemical mechanism at play, or identify the ideal conditions for maximum effectiveness. That would be amazing.
It would. And it just goes to show that even in a world of high-tech solutions, there's still a place for simple natural approaches.
It's a great reminder that there's still so much we don't know about the natural world. There's always something new to learn and discover, even in something as seemingly simple as a bale of barley straw.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about the potential of natural solutions. Not just for algae control, but for all sorts of environmental challenges we face.
Who knows what other folk remedies might be out there just waiting to be studied and understood? What other solutions might we be overlooking simply because they haven't been rigorously tested and validated by mainstream science?
It's an invitation to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that sense of wonder alive. There's a whole world of natural solutions out there waiting to be discovered.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of barley straw and algae control. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and maybe learned a thing or two along the way.
We encourage you to keep experimenting, keep learning, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to make the next big breakthrough.
Happy ponding, everyone!